Welcome back to another episode on Andrew Tate, continuing from our previous discussion. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It really motivates us to create more content. Thank you, and enjoy the episode.
It feels like two separate lives, doesn't it? Going from dominating in an incredibly intense arena like professional fighting
Yeah,
to becoming this massive global force in a completely different world like online influence. It's quite the leap.
it really is.
But what if, deep down, the core skills that allowed for success in one are actually, the very same skills needed for the other?
That's exactly what we're diving into today. You've shared a stack of sources detailing Andrew Tate's journey, and our mission is to unpack them.
Right.
We want to understand the specific steps, the strategies, and maybe the core lessons that the material says allowed him to make that leap.
From world champion kickboxer to...
To a dominant global online figure. We're really here to extract the key nuggets of knowledge the sources offer about this evolution.
Right. We're looking at material that traces his path from, like, the training gym in Luton all the way to the bright, often controversial light of the internet. It's about digging into the information provided and seeing what valuable insights it gives us about, say, discipline, strategy, and how someone might navigate vastly different fields.
Think of it as exploring the architecture of his success as it's presented in this material anyway.
Okay.
We're looking for those foundational lessons that, according to these sources, seem to transcend any single profession.
Like, what did The Ring teach him that applied to reality TV and then...
Exactly. And then to building an online empire. That's the thread we're pulling.
Okay, let's unpack this first phase, then the kickboxing career, as described in the sources. It sounds like it wasn't just a hobby for him.
No, not at all.
The material frames it as a vocation, even a battlefield where he aimed to assert supremacy. He turned pro, 2007?
Yeah, 2007. And the sources really emphasized that his rise wasn't purely about physical talent. I mean, talent helps, but
Sure.
it was built on intense discipline and work ethic. They describe it as relentless diligence, a commitment that verges on obsession.
And you see the results in the titles.
Definitely. ISKA English Cruiserweight in 2009, IKF British Cruiserweight in 2011, and then reaching the peak with the ISK World Light Cruiserweight in 2013.
And the sources point to specific examples of this intensity, right? It wasn't just, going to the gym.
No, far from it.
The training is described as dismantling yourself to construct something far more formidable, pushing through serious pain, even fighting with injuries. Sprains, fractures.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the physical toll, which was obviously immense.
Right.
The sources detail the mental strain, too, the dread of defeat, the burden of expectations, the sheer solitude of the fight.
Wow.
They mention nights where sleep was a luxury because a match was looming. That kind of pressure.
Even something like nutrition was part of this battle plan.
Totally. The sources highlight a really stringent diet, often just chicken, rice, and vegetables.
The classic fire diet.
Right. Meticulously planned, not just for basic sustenance, but for peak performance and, crucially, making weight. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, according to the sources. They make it very clear that these physical and mental trials weren't just like requirements for kickboxing. They frame them as foundational lessons, teaching perseverance, unwavering consistency, and instilling this understanding that true success comes from arduous labor.
Just outworking everyone.
Basically, yeah. And the willingness to simply outwork others. The material portrays it as learning to conquer life itself, seeing pain as something fleeting, and actively turning it into an ally.
So the core argument from the sources is that the gym, the diet, the contests, they weren't just sports activities. They were like academies.
Exactly, academies. Teaching that the mind can be conditioned just like the body.
Okay.
That fear, doubt, suffering, they can be powerful instruments for growth. And this intense resilience, according to the sources, became the driving force for everything that followed.
His businesses, his influence.
Platforms like Hustlers University, yeah. It all supposedly stems from this foundation.
It really does raise an important question for you, the listener, based on this perspective. How much of our own potential might we be leaving untapped simply by, avoiding hardship?
Yeah, the sources here strongly suggest that embracing challenge is essential, not just for building resilience, but for demonstrating it, too.
Right. Okay, so moving on from the ring itself.
Now, the sources shift to the end of his kickboxing career. And what's notable is that it wasn't a defeat that forced him out, according to this material.
Not like a knockout loss or anything.
No, they describe it as a strategic retreat. By 2016, he'd achieved the World Championships, but a significant challenge emerged, a medical condition, specifically involving loose retinas in both eyes.
Wow, that sounds incredibly serious for a fighter. That's your vision.
Hugely serious. The sources state that this condition made every single fight endanger his vision.
Okay.
And they argue the terror of losing his sight was the real reason for withdrawing, which is distinct from any, dread of defeat.
Makes sense. A specific moment the sources highlight is after a 2020 match, right? Against Cosmin Langor.
Yeah, that's the one. He won the fight, but the aftermath apparently showed his body had become a hindrance. At that point, according to the sources, the risk now outweighed the reward. Plain and simple.
So it's presented as a conscious choice to step back, recognizing, as the sources put it, that his larger vision involved ventures beyond just physical confrontation.
Exactly. Ventures he had already started building, through social media and his teachings.
Yeah.
It wasn't starting from scratch.
Right. He was already branching out.
Precisely. The sources framed this retirement not as abandoning the sport, but explicitly as refocusing his energies.
Okay.
They argued that the discipline, the drive, the resilience cultivated in kickboxing weren't exclusive to that sport, but were intrinsic to him, part of mastering domination, not just in the ring, but in life. That's the framing.
And that final recorded fight in 2020, the sources describe it less as an end and more as a transformation.
Yeah, a moment of clarity where his journey was consciously shifting to a different arena.
Okay.
And what's fascinating here is the lesson the sources draw from this pivot. It's about the art of knowing when to change course in life.
That's a big one.
Huge. Recognizing that success isn't necessarily tied to one single arena and that skills are highly transferable. It comes down to discerning when the risks truly eclipse the benefits.
And having the guts to actually do it.
And having, as the sources say, the bravery and insight to alter your course.
Pivoting, as this material presents it, isn't framed as defeat at all. It's a strategic move forward. It's about understanding your worth isn't confined to one role, but defined by what you contribute, wherever that might be.
Right. The discipline, toughness, adaptability, those were powerful assets in combat.
And the sources say they were applied directly to other areas: construction, education, leadership.
Exactly. Retiring was presented almost as an affirmation of using those experiences for influence on a much grander scale. The sources suggest this experience taught him, and it's a lesson he now apparently imparts, the significance of reinvention.
Not just resting on your laurels.
Not clinging to past achievements, but actively anticipating future possibilities. The end of his sports career is framed as a commencement. Proof that the warrior spirit, as they define it, is really about the unyielding quest for mastery over life itself.
So when you look at it through the lens of these sources, it really suggests that the skills you build in one intensely focused area of life might be exactly what you need to succeed in the next. And the challenge is having the courage and, I guess, the insight to make that shift.
That seems to be the core argument presented here.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The sources describe his move from the ring into reality television.
Yeah, quite a shift.
And they say he approached this new domain with the same ruthless ambition and strategic acumen.
Right. His first significant foray was Big Brother in 2016.
Okay.
And the material portrays him not just as like a regular contestant wandering in. No, very much as a tactical mastermind. He entered as part of this group called The Others.
Ah, I remember that twist.
Yeah, who had to compete separately just to get into the main house. This setup, according to the sources, was tailor-made for someone who thrives on challenges requiring,
manipulation, strategy.
Manipulation, strategic maneuvering, and outright domination. That's the language used.
And based on the sources, he didn't just participate in the house drama. He's described as having orchestrated the events.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
Using what's called psychological warfare to stir things up and try to control the game's narrative.
But his time was cut short.
It was. Due to controversy surrounding a leaked video, which the sources state was misrepresented by the media.
Okay.
The producers cited information they received as the reason for his removal. But the sources offer a different perspective.
Which is?
That he was simply too powerful a player for the controlled environment. Essentially, too disruptive for the show's format.
Interesting framing. The sources also mention an earlier reality TV appearance, Shipwrecked, way back in 2011.
They do. And while perhaps less about, cunning strategy,
right,
The material suggests he adapted his approach to dominate in this context as well. His participation wasn't focused on forming bonds or friendships.
No campfire songs, then.
Probably not. He was about winning and proving his brand of leadership and control could extend beyond physical combat.
So through these ventures, the sources argue he used reality TV not just for simple fame or, entertainment.
No, it was a tool.
As a stage to amplify his personal brand.
Exactly. It was about showing a persona that transcends sports, one that, as the material puts it, commands attention, manipulates outcomes, and dictates terms, regardless of the setting.
The lesson the sources draw here is about profound adaptability, then, and the strategic enhancement of your personal brand.
Pretty much. Reality TV became, in their view, an expansion of his battlefield, moving from the physical confines of the ring to the broader, more varied landscape of public perception and media influence. The same core skills from combat could, according to the sources, be effectively transposed.
Right, those skills are transferable.
And what's particularly highlighted is how the sources describe his removal from Big Brother. It wasn't treated as a setback, not in their narrative.
How is it framed?
It became an opportunity to demonstrate resilience and defiance, transforming the event into a public statement reinforcing his indomitable spirit, using the controversy itself.
This experience, the sources suggest, taught him that fame in one domain could easily be a springboard for broader influence.
That's the idea. The tactical acumen, the drive, the insight honed in kickboxing weren't industry-specific skills.
But universal life skill.
But rather, as material frames them, universal life skills, applicable anywhere.
He does make you think, based on the source's viewpoint. How can we look at setbacks not just as failures, but as opportunities to maybe reinforce our own narrative and demonstrate resilience?
It's a powerful reframing technique, certainly as presented in this material.
Definitely. Okay, so from reality TV.
Moving into the broader public eye and building influence. The sources describe crafting Andrew Tate's public persona as an art, not an accident.
Deliberate.
Very deliberate, they suggest. It was about creating a character that was distinctive as it was disruptive, specifically designed to, dominate the conversation.
And the sources highlight certain traits as central to this persona. Boldness, unapologetic ambition, being charismatic, controversial, and unabashedly truthful. The aim was apparently to speak to silent frustrations, voicing opinions often considered too raw or provocative for mainstream discourse.
Yes, those character traits of abrasive confidence and a penchant for controversy are presented as the bedrock.
The foundation of the brand.
Exactly. The sources suggest he didn't want to blend in. The goal was to leave an indelible mark. Be unforgettable.
And the material really discusses his strategic use of controversy. When tagged with labels, say, misogynistic or toxic.
Which happened often.
Right. The sources argue he didn't retreat. He advanced, using these labels, in their view, to amplify his narrative and provoke thought on topics like gender roles and success.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, strategically speaking, according to the sources. They frame controversy as a form of currency.
Currency.
Yeah, and what they call the economy of attention. They argue his persona was engineered for impact, not for acceptance.
Okay, that makes sense in today's media landscape.
Right. The aim was to be memorable, to be the center of discussion, whether the reaction was adoration or critique. For him, according to this material, embracing both love and hate was the true hallmark of influence.
Wow.
The sources are quite explicit here, stating that in the arena of public persona, being polarizing isn't just a side effect, it's often the strategy.
So the lesson drawn by the sources is the art of audience connection through memorable, often divisive self-presentation.
Exactly. It wasn't about seeking universal approval, but about resonating powerfully with those who aligned with or were intrigued by his worldview. Fame, in this context, transcends mere visibility. It's about depth of impact and the initiation of dialogues, even difficult ones.
The sources explain his method involved embracing all facets of his personality, even the ones that stirred debate.
Specifically, to differentiate himself.
Authenticity, even when it meant defying conventional norms, is described as his weapon.
That's the framing. Influence wasn't measured by widespread acceptance, but by how profoundly he could affect those who chose to engage.
Learning from the spotlight, as the sources describe it, was fundamentally about enduring and thriving under intense scrutiny.
Which he definitely faced.
Absolutely. He apparently learned that media can misrepresent, But with intelligence and audacity, you can work to command the narrative.
He didn't shy away from it.
No, he embraced it, according to this material, turning every controversy into an opportunity to further his agenda.
Public criticism, in the source's view, became his education. He didn't seek to appease, but to understand, treating every critique as data, essentially to refine his message and approach. He viewed both praise and disdain as indicators of where his influence was effective.
So resilience wasn't just about taking hits.
No, it was about withstanding attacks, yes, but also about learning from them to fortify one's position. Constant adaptation.
The sources discuss this idea of growth under constant observation, mastering being true to himself while strategically managing how he shared his philosophy.
It's a balancing act.
They say missteps taught humility and strategic thinking. The spotlight is framed as a proving ground that revealed, in their view, that true power is internal,
Right.
stemming from a clear sense of self and purpose, regardless of external noise.
A key lesson, according to these sources, is building resilience against public opinion.
Not being swayed by it.
Exactly. It's about not letting judgment steer your course. Criticism can be converted into fuel for advancement. Attempts to undermine you become opportunities to display fortitude and actually harness that scrutiny.
It sounds like they're describing it as a sophisticated game, almost like chess,
Yeah, that's a good analogy based on the description.
where controversial moves are calculated to stimulate thought, engage audiences, and guarantee that even detractors could not overlook him.
It's not presented as controversy for its own sake, but an understanding that in today's attention-saturated world,
Stand out.
standing out requires boldness, uniqueness, and an unapologetic authenticity. That's the argument.
This approach, the sources suggest, captures the essence of leadership, the ability to bend the limelight to reflect your own narrative and will.
Quite a claim.
So, taking a step back now and looking across everything we've discussed from the sources, how do they connect all these different arenas? The kickboxing ring, reality TV, online influence?
The sources really emphasize this wasn't random. It wasn't just stumbling from one thing to the next.
No.
They frame it as a deliberate progression. The core principles mastered in kickboxing, discipline, strategy, and self-promotion were, according to the material, seamlessly adapted to entirely new platforms.
So he learned to assess audiences like opponents.
That's the analogy they draw, seeing interactions as opportunities to assert dominance.
And that carried into reality TV.
Exactly, and was then amplified in the digital realm, which is effectively a global stage with, an infinite audience.
Okay, let's break those down. Discipline first.
Discipline, for instance, translated directly into consistent content creation and audience engagement, just grinding it out online like he did in the gym.
Makes sense. Strategic thinking.
Strategic thinking, which was about anticipating opponents in the ring, expanded to understanding and navigating cultural currents and trends online.
Positioning yourself.
Positioning oneself strategically within the zeitgeist. His social media presence, the sources argue, was a very calculated effort.
And self-promotion, honed under the lights of the ring.
Evolved into what they call digital mastery. Every post, every video, according to the sources, became a strategic move to increase his influence.
Converting followers into, what was it?
Into students, into adherents of the Tate way of life, building a community, or maybe more accurately, an empire around his brand.
What's particularly compelling is the source's final point on this.
Yeah, the overarching theme.
They argue that discipline, strategic thinking, and self-promotion aren't confined to a single job or industry.
Right, they're foundational.
They are presented as foundational principles for achieving success in any endeavor.
The discipline forged in kickboxing became, in the source's view, a life philosophy of constant self-improvement.
Not just physical.
No, intellectual and philosophical growth, too, ensuring relevance across different phases and platforms.
Strategic thinking, originally about predicting fight outcomes.
Transformed into understanding and navigating cultural currents and trends online, allowing him to position himself strategically within the zeitgeist. They really stress that his social media was a calculated effort.
We keep coming back to that calculated aspect.
It's a strong theme in the source material.
And self-promotion in the ring evolved into powerful brand building and empire creation, being your own advocate.
Yeah, and standing out by confidently broadcasting one's narrative and value, not waiting for permission.
The sources ultimately argue that success hinges not on the industry, but on how one applies these core values.
It's about mastering the game's play, as they put it, adapting these principles to make every arena one's own.
So regardless of the label.
Right. Athlete, reality star, influencer. The goal, as presented, is to remain the dominant narrative setter, the architect of their own success story.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive into the sources certainly gives us a clear framework for understanding that journey, at least based entirely on the material provided.
It does lay out a specific narrative.
From the relentless discipline needed in the ring through that incredibly strategic decision to pivot due to health, applying that competitive fire to reality TV, and then very deliberately crafting a polarizing persona online, the sources consistently trace an application of core principles across different stages.
Exactly. The sources connect the dots, arguing that the mental toughness, the strategic approach, and the willingness to consistently promote himself and his ideas were transferable assets.
Right.
It's presented as a deliberate evolution, where each new environment became a stage for reinvention and, in their view, dominance.
The sources really drive home that point about universal principles, that the lessons learned under immense pressure in one field could truly be the blueprint for success in another if you're strategic enough to see those connections and, I guess, brave enough to make that fundamental shift.
It really does raise an important final question for you, the listener, to consider, based on everything we've explored in these sources today.
What's that?
How are the skills and the resilience you're building right now, in whatever your current challenges are? How are they preparing you for future, completely different arenas you might not have even imagined yet?
That's a great thought to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, where we take your sources and work to find the unexpected connections and crucial insights within them.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep applying those lessons wherever you find them.
That's all for today. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share to support us. The next episode will drop soon with more exciting content on the way. Gen Z creatives unmasking the new era.